from Wycliffe. You'll see there, we're just going to briefly discuss the concept of the Lollards. The Lollards were a group of people there in England, and what they did is they got together in groups and they read the Bible. That's what they did. They weren't affiliated with the church. They didn't have the doctrinal foundation, the basis of faith. They just got together and read the scriptures. They would be oppressed and persecuted by the Catholic Church because of that, and they actually would end up writing some articles that were denounced eventually by the Catholic Church. But the Lollards were accused of really a great rebellion because they wanted to read the scriptures on their own. And can you guess what Bible they used? It was the Wycliffe Bible. And so that was their main Bible of choice, the English version of the Wycliffe Bible. And so the Lollards, when they would read the Wycliffe Bible, it would be the hand-printed version of that. And some people would say that they actually, printed that more, like hand-printed that or wrote things out from that. So you might even have some versions that may have been found because of that as well. Right? Let's see. In 1407, Wycliffe's Bibles were banned, and death by fire if you were found to have a Wycliffe Bible. So you can see that the Lollards and others were taking a chance even with their own lives at that point. All right. One more just quick thing about Wycliffe himself. It was said that he didn't have a lot of persecution because he knew a lot of the nobility in that age or that time period. However, in 1415, this would be after Wycliffe's death in 1415, the church, the Catholic Church, had a council, and they condemned Wycliffe's teachings and his translation. And so after they condemned that, now you got to look at this. He died in 1384. They condemned his teaching in 1415. That's 31 years after he died. And then, in order to put the icing on the cake, they exhumed his body, burned his body, and then took his ashes and threw them into the river, just to prove a point. The Catholic Church did not want any kind of texts or scriptures that were outside of their church. After that time, though, the Lollards, they continued making their copies and reading their Wycliffe Bibles, and some people say that we have today some of the ancient, the oldest texts of this Bible are from the Lollards.
What was their complaint? That they did? Was it the translation itself, or just the fact that people were giving their own copy?
You mean the Catholic Church?
Yeah. Why were they so upset?
They did not want the people reading and having their own copy of the Bible.
So it wasn't anything about the translation.
No.
Necessarily. It's just the fact that it was being passed out.
Right. From my understanding, there was no indictment on the fact that, this translation is a bad translation. They just didn't want it. Right. So let's take a look then at the printed circulation. Remember, everything until this time was hand copied. And now all of a sudden in 1440, we have Gutenberg's printing press is created or, founded. And so at his printing press, now all of a sudden the books of the Bible and other ancient manuscripts could be printed at what we would call lightning speed at that time, because hand printing was obviously slow and painstaking, but now they could print them much faster. F.F. Bruce explains that the Pentateuch in Hebrew, now the Pentateuch, if you hear me say that, Penta means 5, so it's just the first 5 books of the Old Testament. So that'd be Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. All right, it's also known as the Torah. So, and we'll talk more about that when we get into the Old Testament here in a couple weeks. But the Hebrew was printed at Bologna in North Italy in 1482 for the first time. And then the complete Hebrew Bible, which would have been the Old Testament text, in 1488 in a city by the name of Socino near Cremona, which is also in Italy. So the New Testament then was printed in Greek in 1514 Remember, when we say printed, we're not talking hand copied now. We're talking on printing press, finally printed, at Alcala in Spain under the direction of Cardinal Ximenes. And so this appeared with the Latin Vulgate. So they were keeping the original text, which mostly it was translated from. So you had the Latin Vulgate and the Greek text then. So there was in parallel. So you had Latin Vulgate on one side and the Greek text on the other in these prints. As well as this early print had the Septuagint. And I don't know if we talked a little bit about the Septuagint last week, but the Septuagint is the Old Testament scriptures, the 39 books that we have. It was the Hebrew of that translated into Greek. So the Greek version of the Hebrew text would be known as the Septuagint. Okay? So I think there in your notes you may have the first Greek Testament to be published, therefore was the first edition prepared by Erasmus. So now remember, this is Greek. This isn't English. This is a Greek text that's being published on the printing press, okay? And it was printed in Switzerland, and it was published in 1516, March specifically of 1516, all right? So then you have all these different dates, 1519, 1522, 1527, 1535, that form the basis of foundation of Luther's German New Testament. So you have this stuff going on in England and Spain with Erasmus, and then you also have in 1522 and 1527, you have Luther beginning to print his German Bible for his New Testament in German. Okay? And then you have Tyndale's printing in English in like 1525. So you have all these different places around the globe protesting against the Catholic Church, trying to get the Bible into English, and now they're using a printing press to try to do this. Okay?
Are you aware of any discoveries, like from Wycliffe through this time? Was it pretty much, they were all the same?
Yeah.
Nothing was changed, nothing was added, it was just being translated to other languages and reproduced.
Yep. Some of the guys would go back to the original Greek and Hebrew texts that they had, but they didn't have a lot of those texts because a lot of them haven't been found yet. But majority of these were either from like the Latin Vulgate that they were going from. Matter of fact, we'll find out here in a little bit, a lot of times, like you find Tyndale use some of Wycliffe's stuff, and you'll find out that Coverdale used Tyndale and Wycliffe stuff. So they were, everybody.
So there was no discoveries then, not until the Dead Sea.
Well, there were some before the Dead Sea, some Greek stuff, but that kind of exploded everything, the Dead Sea Scrolls. But there have been a lot in just even recent times, like within the last 100 years, there's been a lot of discoveries of ancient texts.
Oh, right, but I mean through Tyndale and everybody else.
Yeah, no. From my understanding, yeah, there was not a lot of new discoveries as far as texts. Yeah. So this guy by the name of Erasmus, we're just going to take just a quick look at him. So he's in the 15th century. He's in Constantinople, which is modern-day Istanbul. And Constantinople is defeated, and the Muslims are starting to move west in this conquest of the Islamic front. And while they're doing that, some of the scholars in Constantinople had to bring their manuscripts with them to Europe as they're being shipped off to Europe. And these manuscripts would have been Greek manuscripts that they were using. And so in Europe, the official Bible of Europe was the Latin Vulgate, which was in Latin. And so you've got roughly like 1,100 years in this process that's happening. And you've got this guy by the name of Erasmus, who was born in, according to Bruce in history, he was born in 1466. And he was a Dutch philosopher. He was a Catholic theologian. And he was believed to have studied all the original sources. And so from his Roman Catholic scholarship, he started to recognize, just like these other guys, hey, we need something in the form that people can read. But his form was the Greek. So he began to take, I think it appears here that according to James White, he took around 12 manuscripts that he had, all right, and he worked over the process of however many years he took, and he began to take from the Latin, and he translated back into the Greek for this purpose. And then these would be published or printed out. So Revelation, his book of Revelation, it has the fewest of copies, or he had the fewest copies of Revelation to try and translate from or to. And Erasmus, he couldn't find any real late Greek copies. And so with that, he had commentary embedded into it. So the copies that he had commentary embedded into it. So it was said that Erasmus didn't even have a lot of respect for the book of Revelation. So I don't know if that means that we don't know how well he translated the book of Revelation, or that just means that as a good scribe, he translated the best he could, but he didn't have a lot of good text to translate from, if that makes sense. So Erasmus then, he's trying to put the Bible together in Greek so he can get it to the printer and get published. And he's hurrying because there's a race to try and get all this done because there's other people on other parts of the globe trying to do this. And it is believed that he made a lot of mistakes in his translation because of the fact that he was rushing it. Matter of fact, when he got to the end, he realized that he didn't even have Revelation chapter 22 in his text. So what is said is that since he didn't have Revelation 22 in his text, he just went ahead and got the Latin Vulgate and he translated, instead of translating from the original, he translated from the Latin Vulgate, Revelation 22, into the Greek. And then he sent it to the publishers and it was published. Once it was published, according to history, it was well received by the people, but he had to get papal licensure in order to get it out there and start to promote it. So the way he did that was he dedicated it to the Pope. And when he dedicated it to the Pope gave him license, and then he was able to publish it all over the area there.
That's ironic.
Yeah, a little bit, right? As long as you pay the piper, you can probably do just about anything. So this is where we get this term. I don't know if you've ever heard of this term, the Textus Receptus. But there are different texts that are translated from the Textus Receptus. Erasmus's text was known as the Textus Receptus, and all that means is it was the received text. So the people received this text. It was the one that they felt was well received or good, and so that's what they named it. And so his translation here of the Bible with the Latin and the Greek referred to the Textus Receptus. Okay. Any questions up until then?
Would that put us close to this Bible I got in front of me?
Some of our newer Bibles, like the New American Standard, actually uses some of the Textus Receptus in order to translate. So it all depends on what they translated from. So you might find that if you look in the early sections of your Bible, it usually tells you who the translators were and what they translated from, what text they used to translate from. Most Bibles will tell you that. And every translation is a little bit different, and some do it differently.
Hey, Brian,
Yes.
is there any evidence or any writings out there of God working through these gentlemen as they're writing this? Did they have any testimonies or stories as they worked through this of God working in their lives?
There probably are. You would just have to go back and probably study like the life of Erasmus or the life of Wycliffe and Tyndale. Probably the biggest thing that's always talked about as far as God working is the idea that these men were literally giving up their lives in order to get these texts into the common people's hands, and how God was able to use that and even get that out. Because the Catholic Church was powerful. And so in order for this to happen, I don't see how it could have happened outside of, God's grace and his goodness to his people. But you would probably have to go back and actually study each individual person and look at all the different writings of historical value that would talk about that. And you might find some miracles going on and happening.
I have a question.
Yes.
If whoever it was that left out chapter 22 in the book of Revelation, how do we know? Is that the same that we have today?
Well, Erasmus, he had realized that he left it out, so he went back, and instead of translating from the original manuscripts that he was working with, he translated from the Latin Vulgate, which had Revelation 22 in it, but it was translated in Latin, which would have been Jerome's translation back in 382. So when Jerome translated from the Greek text into the Latin, then that would have been where he got Revelation 22. So he literally was taking and translating Jerome's Latin Revelation 22, and he was translating that into Greek for his testament that he was writing here. And then he published that.
So he caught his mistake before publishing?
Yes, he caught his mistake before publishing.
Okay.
All right. Yeah, so it was there once he published it. He was rushing through and realized that he hadn't had it. So because he didn't have time to go back and he couldn't find it in the manuscripts, he didn't have it in the manuscript, he just went ahead and took it from the Latin, Revelation 22.
Okay.
Again, it was okay.
Even the stuff that the original stuff he did was full of mistakes too. Like it was all kind of a mess because he was in a hurry.
Yeah, there were different areas that he had issues with, but this is going in. He's producing a Greek text of the whole Bible when he does this. So we still don't have it necessarily. His version is in English. It's in Greek, but that Greek version is known as the Textus Receptus, which actually a lot of translations go back to the Textus Receptus because they believe that Erasmus, his work in translating from the Latin and from other Greek and Hebrew into the Greek, they believe that it's fairly solid. So
I have a question about that. So is Greek preferred? I know it has a lot more romantic language in it. Is Greek preferred over the Latin for translation purposes?
I think part of Erasmus's idea is to get back to the original text.
So get it more clearly.
Yeah, you can get it translated back to the Greek for the original text. And then again, this is the idea of, we're talking about now he's wanting to get this printed. We're not talking hand copies anymore. These are printed copies now. And Erasmus was one of the first guys to do that into the Greek and to get them printed.
That didn't solve the problem for common people, though.
No, it didn't. It didn't. But one of the reasons why we need to throw Erasmus in here is because later on, Erasmus's Textus Receptus is used for some of the translations into the English. So that's one of the reasons why we want to make sure we know about that. Now, he did do a second edition, and he had his printer replace his whole work on Revelation using the work of a couple of brothers. They were known as the Align brothers. They did work on Revelation. And so he said, I want to make Revelation a little more, fine-tuned. And so he liked the Align brothers' work on Revelation. So he told his printers, I want you to take their work and put that into my book Revelation and use that. According to history, though, the problem with that is that they later found out that the Align brothers used Erasmus's first edition of Revelation. So he was literally translating his own first edition back into his second edition.
That's why you liked it so much.
That's probably why I like it.
It didn't dawn on him. I've seen this before.
Right. Now, one thing about Erasmus, the Catholic Church was fairly upset and frustrated because, and other scholars, because one of the things that the earliest of manuscripts that they had in that time, Erasmus was using to translate, and they didn't have 1 John 5:7 in the ones he was using. And he had no manuscript before the 14th century contained 1 John 5:7. And 1 John 5:7 says this. Let's see if I can just write down. It says, for there are three that testify, or three that bear witness. Now, the reason why is he didn't include 1 John 5:7 into his text, his edition. And so they said that he was denying the Trinity because he did not include that. But he said, the text that I'm using before the 14th century, they don't include this, so I don't want to include it in my text. So they said, well, you're going against Scripture, you're trying to deny the Trinity. And so they kept pressing him, and long story short, eventually, in his later editions, he included 1 John 5:7.
Was he in good standing with the Catholic Church? Like, was he in line with their?
No, he did. That's one of the reasons he was trying to do this as well, even from the original Greek.
Because I noticed he was a priest, so
Yeah.
he was all in, but
Yeah,
He also wrote a book about free will.
right.
So he was probably aggravating the Catholic
Yep,
Church.
yep.
Well, the Catholics, they have extra books, don't they, or different?
The apocryphal books, yeah.
Okay, so did he include those in his version?
Not to my knowledge, he did not include the apocrypha.
So he was bucking the system.
So all these guys that we're talking about were bucking a system, and there were more. Like there's people going. I mean, you got to remember, you have copies of the Bible being translated in Coptic, Ethiopian, all kinds of languages going on all over the world. This is just talking about our modern day English version and how we kind of get there. And this comes from England and Germany, and so here we are in 2023, and we're just kind of looking back on this. So after Erasmus, you should have in your notes there a guy by the name of William Tyndale. And Tyndale's translation was the first English translation to be printed. Wycliffe's was the first to be copied. Tyndale's was the first to be printed. So he's born and educated in Oxford and Cambridge. He studies Greek under a professor by the name of Richard Croke. He supposedly was fluent in Hebrew, Greek, Latin, French, Italian, and native English. Okay, and this is not abnormal for these guys. I mean, John Wesley, who was even a later Christian guy, he was known to be fluent in a lot of different languages. So this was fairly common, at least for educated people, educated in Oxford and Cambridge, to have a lot of language under their belt. But like his predecessors, Wycliffe and Erasmus, Tyndale believed that the scriptures should be for the common people. And so he decided, well, I need to try and get this done and get it done well. And so you have Luther in Germany, who's translating and has his New Testament in German. And you have Tyndale in England trying to get the same thing done about the same time frame. The problem is that Luther in Germany, he's defying the Catholic Church, and now that word spreads, and Tyndale isn't seen, as a good guy over in England at all doing this because of what's going on with Luther in Germany. And so because of that, Tyndale, even though he's starting to put together his translation of the New and the Old Scriptures, he's seen as someone who defies the papacy. And so Tyndale is now an enemy of the Catholic Church, just like all these other guys. And he tries to get episcopal licensure. It says in the history, that he actually had a meeting set, but he couldn't get any kind of licensure through the church. So Tyndale headed to Germany in 1524. So in order for him to make this translation and to try and get it done, he goes to Germany to try and get it accomplished. And the history says that by around 1525, which is about a year later, his English New Testament was practically complete now, while he was in Germany. And then he has a printer by the name of Quentel. That's his last name, Peter Quentel. He was going to print this in Cologne, Germany. And so they're getting everything ready, and they're getting ready to print this. And as they're printing it, all of a sudden, the Senate of Cologne comes in and says, we heard that somebody's trying to print an English version of the Bible, and they stopped it. And so he gets away with, according to my notes here, according to Bruce, F.F. Bruce, he gets away with about 80 pages of his New Testament printed. Now, this is not hand copied, but this is printed. He gets away with about 80 of them. And then after he gets away with that, he goes to a place called Rhine of Worms.
Oh, boy.
You know where that's at, right, Tia?
Oh, yeah. Sounds delicious.
So, I'm telling you what, as I walk through this, and I told you before, I'm not a history guy, but when I want to study the Bible, I try to learn more history. I had to look all these places up. And this is a town in Germany, and it's just called Worms, but it's Rhines of Worms. But the Worms,
It's pronounced Burns.
yeah, Worms, right, with a W. Yeah, you're right. So that was known as the Worms New Testament. All right, and they say that there are actually two copies still around today. One is at the Baptist College of Bristol, and one is at St. Paul's Cathedral.
Wow. How'd they get there?
I couldn't tell you that. We'll have to study that history. And there'll probably be a lot of other towns we don't have any idea where they came from. I think this should be in your notes, though. Tyndale's translation used very modern language. This is one of the first places where you see different words coming into English that we might understand more readily. So instead of using priests in Tyndale's versions, he would use the word presbyter or elder. So it's the first time you get the concept of an elder. Then in Tyndale's book, instead of using charity, he used the word love. And so this is Tyndale's translation. So he begins to modernize the whole thing. Right?
Tyndale and Erasmus lived at the same time, right? I think they died the same year.
Yep.
So Tyndale wasn't using Erasmus's work.
Mm-mm.
What was he using?
Well, we'll get there here in just a minute. So Tyndale, his copies get to England, but being affiliated with the Lutheranism that he talked about, it would be impossible to get anybody in England to do anything, to get them across England. So there was a guy by the name of, he was a bishop, he was named Cobert, Tom Stahl, that's Bruce, F.F. Bruce, in his book, The History of the English Bible. This guy looked to purchase all of the copies and then burn them. So they were coming from Germany into England, and this bishop says, I'm going to get the copies and I'm going to burn them all so that nothing can be done with them. Well, in a version of this story, Tyndale is made aware of this by one of his printers. And so when Tyndale is made aware of this, the printer says, I'll tell you what, I'm sending this in, the bishop is buying them and then burning them. I'm just going to give you the money because they're yours. I'll give you the money. And because Tyndale, from my understanding, was a very poor guy. He wasn't very wealthy. And he says, you can get wealthy on this. And instead of him getting wealthy, he paid for more copies and he flooded England so that the bishop couldn't buy all of them and sell all of them or burn all of them. And so the story goes that he eventually flooded the market to such a degree that the bishop wasn't able to buy enough and he was able to get his English translations out.
Once again, they weren't complaining about the text. They were just complaining that it was getting passed out.
Yep. So Tyndale now has been in hiding for like 12 years after this whole thing happens. He's betrayed by someone and he's arrested and then he's burned at the stake. And while he's being burned at the stake, he cries out, Lord, would you open the King of England's eyes? While he's being burned at the stake. 3 months, I put a few months in the notes, I don't know if you have that, but I think it's 3 months. But 3 months later, his Bible was legalized in England. So he's burned, and 3 months later, it's finally legalized. And it's legalized by King Henry VIII. And the story of King Henry VIII, we can look at that, but the idea was that King Henry VIII, he wanted a divorce from his first wife, and the Catholic priest would not give it to him. He actually had 6 wives total, but his first wife, and the reason he wanted a divorce is because she couldn't give him an heir to the throne. So King Henry pretty much made himself king of the Catholic Church. And as king of the Catholic Church, then he legalized that. And in the process of legalizing it, he had a guy by the name of Cranmer, Archbishop Cranmer. And Cranmer had the same kind of idea as Tyndale and Wycliffe and all these guys, Erasmus. He wanted to get the Bible into the hands of the common people, into their own tongue. And then he said, okay, we're going to legalize this. But when they legalized it, he turned it into the what he called the Matthew Bible. And so the Matthew Bible was the main Bible then of England for that time period. The problem with it is that later on they found out that the Matthew Bible was actually false. So there was not someone by the name of Matthew that had translated it. It was a fake. At the end of the translation, or somewhere in the translation, it has that the translation was done by W.T. William Tyndale. And so it's believed that William Tyndale is actually the person that copied and translated that Matthew Bible that was actually put throughout all of England.
Did they just change the name so it would be more acceptable? Or? Like why
Why did they,
call it
why
the
did they throw the
Tyndale?
Matthew label on it,
Right.
just to hide it?
Well, okay, so the Matthew Bible was a combined work of three individuals. And that would have been Tyndale, probably the Vulgate, and possibly Erasmus's Latin version.
And Martin Luther's like 5 years after this, it's the Reformation, right? It's like right.
Yeah, actually, Martin Luther, the Reformation is a little bit after this, but Martin Luther is actually translating his copies of the Bible
So
at
he's
the same time.
busy at the same time.
Well, Bob had asked earlier if there are any stories behind these people, like of God intervening in their lives. Well, having all of these people writing at the same time, I think, is a God thing because not one person can stop, all of these people writing at the same time.
Right.
But it shows the power of God's word.
Right.
It's gonna go. If God wills.
Yeah.
So then you come to a guy by the name of Miles Coverdale. You should have that in your notes. He studied at Cambridge as well. He was an Augustinian friar. And at this point, David, you were like, some of these guys were part of the Catholic Church. There really was no other church. So if you were going to study religion or the faith, you were studying it usually in the Catholic Church, or you were rebellious.
What I was wondering were any of these guys going against the Catholic Church like Luther did?
Yeah.
Luther made it public, but I was wondering if any of these other guys were.
In the study that I've done in the history of these guys did not see the same persecution or hatred, other than when they had their version of their translation, then the church was like, we're against it.
But they weren't trying to announce something in opposition to what the popes were preaching.
It doesn't appear like Luther
did.
Yeah.
Luther came out publicly against the Catholic Church.
Yeah.
But these other guys weren't doing that. They were just printing it.
Yeah. Some of if I go all the way back, I think Wycliffe actually wrote articles that they later denounced as well. But
Against the Catholic Church?
Against the Catholic Church, because they were against the Mass, they were against the Eucharist, they were against the fact that priests, held the office.
I knew Luther was, but I didn't know if these other guys
were. Oh yeah, these other guys were against that too.
Oh, okay.
But I don't think they were as vocal, and I don't think they saw the persecution and the other than the fact that they were burned at the stake, later on. And then you got like Wycliffe, his body was exhumed and burned. So then you got Miles Coverdale. So we're getting now into like the 1500s. He studied at Cambridge as well. He was against the Eucharist and the Mass and the worship of images and confession. And he wanted to make the Bible accessible just like all these other guys. So F.F. Bruce says that it's believed that he was actually an assistant to Tyndale. So again, here you have Coverdale, who's an assistant to Tyndale, so that means he would have access to or had access to or was helping with Tyndale's translation. And so Coverdale was actually asked to revise the Matthew Bible by a guy by the name of Cromwell. And under King Edward VI in 1551, Coverdale became bishop during that time. And then he was quickly removed after that because Mary Tudor ascended to the throne in 1553. And she didn't want nothing to do with that because she was all about the Catholic Church and she didn't want Coverdale in there. So he had a short 1 year, long-lived opportunity to do that. And so then Coverdale's translation was completed in 1535, October of 1535, and it was known as the Coverdale Bible. All right? And listen, it was the first complete printed Bible in English. So Coverdale is your first complete printed version of the Bible in English. Okay, printed, not hand copy, but printed. So here's the thing about Coverdale. Coverdale admits in some of his writings to not be an expert in Hebrew and Greek, but he would use both German and Latin versions to translate his Bible. So he would use the Latin and the German to translate his Bible. Tyndale, although he made a good attempt, he never completed the Old Testament according to Coverdale. So Coverdale, in some of Coverdale's writings, he says Tyndale really didn't complete all of the Old Testament. So Coverdale says, I made that whole thing complete. However, according to history, he heavily relied upon Tyndale's work in the New Testament. Okay? So just a little bit of background there. He pretty much used the Latin and the German to translate the Coverdale Bible. Yeah, Chuck.
I just want to make sure that when people read that these people, Coverdale challenged the Eucharist, he wasn't against the Lord's Supper. What he was against was substantiation.
Yep.
In other words, that when you eat the bread, it turns into the body of Christ. You drink the wine, it turns into the blood of Christ. That's what they were against, not honoring the Lord's Supper.
Right. That's a good point. So Coverdale has used Luther's German translation. He used the Latin Vulgate for the most part, and he translated into the first printed English Bible. And now under Cranmer and the King there in England, the Bible is now licensed and it's distributed throughout the land. Okay. And then I'm going to try to fly through this if we can, so we get finished. I gave us 2 weeks. If we have to jump back in, we can next week and try to finish this. But then you have in 1539 what's known as the Great Bible, or the Bible in English. The title of the Great Bible suggests that it was produced, and it was produced by more or better learned men. Okay.
But also the fact that it was.
Yes, right. That's the other fact.
That's really why they call it the Great Bible.
Yeah.
It's huge.
So Chuck makes, I've never seen it.
Is that because of the print size?
I don't know exactly why. I don't. Nobody's carrying that around in their living room though, or putting it on their coffee table.
It was chained to a pulpit, wasn't it? Fixed to a pulpit.
I don't know the history on that. I did see that it was really huge, but I thought the main thing was because they wanted to use more excellent learned men, according to this quote that I have here. However, just listen to this, how interesting this is, okay? The Great Bible, done by learned men, it was actually Coverdale's revision of the Matthew Bible. So in other words, this is according to F.F. Bruce, in other words, it was Coverdale's revision of John Rogers' revision of Tyndale's Bible. So again, you see, these are men, just basic men. All right, nothing special about these men, but they're very well learned in the languages. And then you've got the Catholic Church and you've got the king involved, and they're doing their best to try and get this into the language of the common everyday person. But they're men. They're not always perfect. And they're revising things from other people's revisions, and so they're working as best they can. So we have to trust that in all of these men, one thing is common in all of them, and that is that their heart is right to want to get the Word of God into the hands of the common people.
And again, the reason was to try to get people to understand that what the Roman Catholic Church was promoting was not legitimate.
Yeah, right.
So it was an effort, all of this was an effort to educate people to understand that what the Catholic Church was doing was screwed up.
Most definitely. Yeah. So you have a lot of history passing through there. You have King Edward. You have Elizabeth, who became queen after Mary. And so the Catholic Church is going through a lot of changes. And then the next Bible that comes on the scene is known as the Geneva Bible. And the Geneva Bible was the Bible of the Puritans. The Puritans loved the Geneva Bible. That's the Bible that they used. And the Puritans were a group of people that came out of England, and they were also looking to get free from the ways of the Catholic Church, but they also believed that God had called them to a life of holiness and transformation, and they didn't believe that the Catholic Church was offering any of that. All right. So just real quick, the Geneva Bible was, according to F.F. Bruce, the Geneva Bible was the Bible of Shakespeare.
You can still get it today.
Yeah.
You can still get it today. It was mid-15 something.
Right. So actually, the Geneva Bible in some places is referred to as the Puritan Bible because that was their main Bible choice. And then after the Geneva Bible, we have the King James Bible.
Excuse me,
Yeah, go ahead.
being the Puritan Bible, that would be the one that would show up in the New England area. When our first settlers came over.
Yeah.
More likely.
Yeah, more than likely. Yeah.
I would think.
Because the Puritans would have come over not too long after that. So yeah.
So you have to understand, there's a difference between the Puritans and the Pilgrims.
Yes.
And we want them.
Yeah. There is. And probably a difference between Quakers, right? Because you were talking about those the other day. Yeah, and the dirty Nazarenes.
No.
Sorry.
That's a subject for another time.
April, you need to be sitting closer so you can kick me and start trying to say stuff. All right.
Just for your information, some of the early printed Bibles out of Germany are located right here in Newfield.
Really?
Yes.
Where, right.
I won't tell you where,
Oh,
but they are. They're in the Amish possession.
Oh.
museum, there's a museum somewhere. What is it?
And there's a couple of individuals that have even larger libraries that are personal libraries.
Wow.
Wow.
I've seen one.
And we actually asked him if he would come and talk here, and he said yes.
Wow.
Yes.
Can you say that again real quick? Marie didn't hear that. Oldest?
There's some of the very old Bibles from Germany are located right here in Millfield. One Bible is the only one known to be printed. Is right here in Millfield.
Wow.
Is it at the Amish Museum?
It's may or may not be at the Amish Museum. Okay? But it's here in Millfield.
town.
I don't know. I don't know. But a lot of this gentleman that has the large storage that I saw, he has donated a lot of his stuff to the museum. And when he passes away, we'll probably give the rest of it to the museum.
My dad was involved with that. I have a very old German Bible, Old New Testament, that I just got from Dad after he passed away.
Wow.
Is it in English or
German.
German.
Like, what do they call that?
Pardon?
What do the Amish speak in Low German? And then there's
Well,
High
they
German.
read a High German, they speak a Low German.
And the closest dialect is Frankfurt
Stuttgart.
or Stuttgart.
Stuttgart.
Wow.
Interesting.
Well, I'll tell you what, we will extend this because I don't want to get into the King James Bible because there'll probably be a lot of discussion as we walk through
Can we
that.
just skip the King?
We could. We could. Yeah.